In the harsh wilderness of the 1880s American Southwest, Aiyana, a 30-year-old Apache warrior, has spent 3 years wandering the desert after losing his entire family in a cavalry raid. Hardened by grief and surviving alone, he encounters a blind, starving dog, lost in the unforgiving landscape. What begins as a reluctant rescue becomes a profound journey of healing, as both the broken man and the helpless animal learn to trust again. Through their bond, Aiyana discovers that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't fighting, it's learning to love again, even when your heart has been shattered beyond repair. The desert wind carried death in its wisp. Aiyana pressed his weathered palm against the red sandstone, feeling the tremor of hoofbeats still echoing through the earth. Cavalry horses, maybe a day's ride south. His dark eyes scanned the endless expanse of sage and shadow, muscles tensed beneath skin, bronzed by 30 years under the merciless sun. 3 years, 3 years, since the bluecoats had torn his world apart, leaving him to wander these wastelands like a ghost haunting his own life. The wind shifted, and with it came a sound that made his blood still. Whimpering, Aiyana's hand instinctively moved to the worn handle of his knife. In this land, weakness meant death, and anything that cried was either predator or prey. But as the sound drifted toward him again, thin, desperate, barely more than a breath, something deep in his chest clenched like a fist around his heart. He knew that sound. He had made it himself once, in the darkness after watching his wife Itzel and their daughter Nayeli disappear in smoke and gunfire. Following the sound across the rocky terrain, Aiyana moved with the fluid silence his father had taught him. Every footstep calculated, every breath controlled. The crying grew stronger, more desperate, until he crested a small ridge and saw the source. A dog, medium-sized, its once golden coat now matted with dust and burrs, ribs showing sharp beneath sagging skin. But it was the eyes that stopped Aiyana cold, or rather the lack of sight in them. Clouded white with its blindness, they stared unseeing toward the sky as the animal's sides heaved with exhaustion. The dog was dying. Aiyana remained motionless, studying the scene. The animal's paws were raw and bleeding, its tongue hanging slack with dehydration. Scattered around its prone form were the picked clean bones of some small desert creature, the dog's last unsuccessful hunt, perhaps days ago. "Foolish animal," Aiyana whispered in Apache, his voice rusty from disuse. "The desert shows no mercy to the broken." As if hearing him, the dog lifted its head slightly, those sightless eyes turning toward his voice. The tail, barely more than skin and bone, attempted a weak wag. Even dying, even blind, it hoped for kindness. Aiyana's jaw tightened. Hope was a luxury he'd abandoned in the ruins of his village. This creature would learn, as he had learned, that the world offered only suffering to those foolish enough to trust. He started to turn away, to leave the dog to its inevitable fate. The desert would claim it by morning, as it claimed all things too weak to fight. It was the natural order. The strong survived, the broken perished. But then the dog whimpered again, a sound so small and lost, it seemed to echo not just across the canyon, but across the 3 years since Aiyana had held his dying daughter in his arms. "Papa," Nayeli had whispered, her 7-year-old voice barely audible above the crackle of flames consuming their home. "Papa, I can't see. Everything's dark. I'm here, little star," he had replied, using the pet name that now felt like broken glass in his memory. "I'm here. I'm scared, Papa. Don't leave me in the dark." But he had left her. He had failed to protect her, failed to save any of them, and in his failure he had become like this dog, lost, broken, stumbling blind through a world that no longer made sense. The parallel struck him like a physical blow. The dog raised its head again, panting in the heat, and Aiyana saw something in its bearing that made his breath catch. Despite its blindness, despite its obvious suffering, the animal was still listening, still hoping for a friendly voice to guide it home. Just as Nayali had listened for his voice in those final moments. "Damn you," Aiyana whispered, but he wasn't sure if he was cursing the dog, himself, or the cruel fate that had brought them together in this desolate place. Against every instinct screaming for him to walk away, Aiyana found himself moving down the slope toward the dying animal. Each step felt like betrayal of the hard lessons the last 3 years had taught him. Betrayal of the protective numbness he'd wrapped around his heart like armor. The dog's ears perked at his approach, its blind eyes searching uselessly for the source of the footsteps. When Aiyana knelt beside it, close enough to see the fleas crawling through its matted fur, the animal tried again to lift its head. "Easy," Aiyana said softly, the Apache word feeling strange after years of silence. "Easy, foolish one." He reached out slowly, letting his fingers brush the dog's head. The animal's tail thumped weakly against the ground, and despite himself, Aiyana felt something crack inside his chest, a fault line in the stone he'd made of his heart. The dog was beyond saving. Even if he shared his precious water, even if he caught game to feed it, the animal was too far gone. The kindest thing would be a quick death, a blade between the ribs to end its suffering. But as Aiyana's hand rested on the dog's warm head, feeling the rapid pulse of a heart that refused to give up, he heard his daughter's voice again. "Don't leave me in the dark, Papa." He had left her. He had failed her. But perhaps he didn't have to fail again. "You are dying, little brother," Aiyana whispered to the dog, using the Apache term for a fellow creature in need. "But you will not die alone in the darkness. This I promise you." The dog's tail wagged once more, as if understanding, and Aiyana began to reach for his water skin. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was foolishness, that water was life in the desert, that saving a dying animal would likely doom them both. But for the first time in 3 years, Aiyana ignored the voice of survival and listened instead to something deeper, something that sounded remarkably like the man he used to be before grief had carved away everything soft in his soul. As the last light faded from the western sky, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, an Apache warrior made a choice that would change everything. In trying to save a blind dog's life, he had no idea he was about to reclaim his own. Water was life in the desert, and Aiyana had learned to measure it in drops, not swallows. His buffalo hide water skin held barely enough to see him through 2 days if he rationed carefully. Sharing it with a dying dog was madness, the kind of foolish sentiment that separated the living from the dead in this unforgiving land. Yet as he uncorked the precious vessel, his hands moved with the steady certainty of a man who had already made his choice. "Consequences be damned. Drink, little brother," he whispered, cupping his palm and pouring a small amount of the warm water into it. "Drink, and we shall see if you have the will to live." The blind dog's nostrils flared at the scent of water. With tremendous effort, it lifted its head and began to lap desperately at Aiyana's palm, its rough tongue scraping against calloused skin. The animal drank as if each drop were a miracle, which Aiyana supposed it was. He gave the dog 3 palmfuls before forcing himself to stop. Too much too fast would make it sick, and he couldn't afford to waste what little remained. The dog whimpered softly when the water stopped coming, but settled back against the rocky ground with something that might have been contentment. "Patient now," Aiyana murmured, surprised to find himself speaking aloud after years of silence. "There will be more when your belly can hold it." The dog's tail gave another weak wag, and something twisted twindly in Aiyana's chest. When was the last time any living thing had shown him gratitude? When had he last been the source of comfort rather than fear? The memories came unbidden. Itzal laughing as their young daughter chased fireflies outside their wickiup, her dark hair catching the firelight. Nayeli running to him when he returned from hunting, her small arms wrapping around his legs as she babbled about her day. A life filled with purpose, with love, with the simple joy of being needed. All of it as now, all of it buried beneath 3 years of walking through the desert like a living ghost. As full darkness settled over the land, Aiyana made camp with practiced efficiency. No fire smoke could be seen for miles, and he had learned to avoid the attention of both soldiers and raiders. Instead, he arranged his bedroll in the shelter of an overhanging rock and gathered the dog carefully in his arms. The animal weighed almost nothing, its body trembling with exhaustion and cold. As Aiyana settled it against his chest, sharing his warmth, the dog pressed its head against his shoulder with a soft sigh. "You trust too easily," Aiyana told it, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Trust will get you killed in this world." But even as he spoke the words, his hand moved gently along the dog's matted fur, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the simple comfort of not being alone. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams that blurred the line between memory and nightmare. He saw Nayeli's face in the flames, heard Etzel calling his name from across an impossible distance. But woven through the familiar anguish was something new, the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing against his chest, proof of life persisting against all odds. Dawn found them both alive, which was more than Aiyana had dared hope. The dog stirred as the first light touched the eastern horizon, its blind eyes turning toward the warmth of the sun it could no longer see. "Still with me, little brother?" Aiyana asked, checking the animal's pulse, stronger than the night before, though still frighteningly rapid. "Good. We have work to do." He gave the dog more water, then set about the grim business of keeping them both alive. Food was the next priority. The dog needed meat if it was going to recover, and Aiyana's own supplies were running dangerously low. Leaving the dog in the shade of the overhang, he set out to hunt. The desert seemed particularly barren that morning, offering little more than lizards and the occasional ground squirrel. But near a dry wash, he found rabbit tracks leading to a warren beneath a fallen log. His father had taught him to hunt these creatures as a boy, showing him how to read the signs, how to be patient, how to move with the silence that separated successful hunters from hungry ones. The lessons came back to him now, muscle memory guiding his hands as he fashioned snares from thin strips of leather. By midday he had caught 2 rabbits, enough to feed them both for several days if he preserved the meat properly. As he prepared to return to the dog, movement caught his eye along the southern ridge. Riders, 3 of them, moving slowly across the landscape with the methodical pattern of men following a trail. Aiyana's blood turned to ice as he recognized the blue uniform. Cavalry scouts, probably from Fort Bowie, and they were heading directly toward the rocky outcrop where he'd left the dog. For a moment, panic seized him. He could run, fade into the desert like smoke, and leave no trail for them to follow. It was what he'd done for 3 years, the skill that had kept him alive when so many others had fallen. But that would mean abandoning the dog, leaving it to die of thirst and starvation in that rocky shelter. The thought hit him like a physical blow, and he realized with startling clarity that he couldn't do it. Somewhere in the space of a single night, the dying animal had become his responsibility, his to protect, just as his family had been, before he'd failed them so completely. "Not again," he whispered to the empty air. "Not again." Moving with desperate speed, Aiyana raced back toward the outcrop. The dog lifted its head at his approach, tail wagging weakly at the sound of familiar footsteps. "We must go, little brother," Aiyana said urgently, gathering the animal in his arms. "The blue coats come, and we cannot let them find us." The dog whimpered softly as Aiyana lifted it, perhaps sensing his fear, but it made no struggle, trusting completely in hands that had shown it nothing but kindness. As Aiyana carried his unlikely companion deeper into the maze of canyons and arroyos that carved the desert landscape, he felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders like a familiar burden. For 3 years, he had carried only his own pain, his own survival. Now he carried something more precious and fragile, another life that depended entirely on his strength, his skill, his willingness to keep fighting when everything inside him wanted to give up. The dog's head rested against his shoulder as they moved through the twisting passages of red rock, and Aiyana found himself speaking softly to calm the animal's fears. "Easy now," he murmured. "I will not let them find us. I will not let them take you from me." The words surprised him with their intensity, and he realized that somewhere in the dark hours of the previous night, something fundamental had shifted inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart hadn't crumbled. They were still there, still protecting him from the worst of his pain. But they had cracked just enough to let one small blind dog slip through. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to begin healing what he'd thought was permanently broken. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls behind them, growing fainter with distance. But Aiyana didn't slow his pace. He had made his choice the moment he'd given the dog water, and now he would see it through to whatever end awaited them, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. For the first time in 3 years, Aiyana had something to live for beyond mere survival. The blind dog in his arms represented hope, fragile as a desert flower but no less real for its delicacy. And hope, he was beginning to remember, was worth fighting for. 3 days deeper into the canyon maze, Aiyana discovered that caring for a blind dog was like learning a new language, one spoken in sounds, scents, and the subtle movements of trust. The dog had survived longer than he'd expected. The rabbit meat, cut into small pieces and fed slowly, had put some strength back into its frail body. More importantly, it had begun to respond to Aiyana's voice, turning its clouded eyes toward him whenever he spoke, ears perking with an attention that reminded him painfully of how Nayeli used to listen to his story. "Easy, Macoons," he said softly, using the Apache word for little bear, as he helped the dog drink from a small pool they'd found in the rocks. The name had come naturally after watching the animal's stubborn determination to keep living, despite everything stacked against it. Macoons lapped carefully at the water, no longer desperate but still grateful for every drop. His tail, fuller now, though still pitifully thin, wagged as Aiyana's hand rested on his back. The simple gesture of trust hit Aiyana like a physical blow each time it happened. "You should fear me," Aiyana whispered, his voice rough with emotion he thought he'd buried. "Everything else in this world does." But Macoons only pressed closer to his leg, seeking the warmth and security that had become the center of his newly returned world. In the 3 days since the rescue, the dog had barely left Aiyana's side, following the sound of his footsteps and voice with complete faith. It was that faith that terrified Aiyana most. The morning of the 4th day brought unwelcome visitors. Aiyana heard them before he saw them. Horses moving through the narrow canyon below, their hooves echoing off the stone walls. He pressed himself against the rock face, one hand gently covering Macoon's muzzle to keep him quiet. 2 men on horseback emerged into the small clearing where the pool lay. Not cavalry this time, but something potentially worse, bounty hunters. Aiyana recognized the type, hard-faced men, with cold eyes and too many guns, the kind who killed for money and slept soundly afterward. "Trail's gone cold," the first man said, dismounting to examine the ground near the water. He was tall and lean, with a graying beard and scars that spoke of a violent life. "Apache's too clever by half." His companion, younger but no less dangerous looking, spat into the dust. "Worth $500, dead or alive. Bastard killed a whole patrol near Tucson, from what I heard." Aiyana's blood chilled. He had killed soldiers, yes, but only when they'd cornered him, only when there was no choice. Somehow the stories had grown in the telling, transforming desperate self-defense into wholesale slaughter. Now he wasn't just a fugitive, he was a legend, complete with a bounty that would draw every killer in the territory. "We'll find him," the older man said, remounting his horse. "Trail may be cold, but Apache's got to eat, got to drink. Desert's big, but not big enough to hide forever." They rode on, their voices fading into the distance, but their words lingered like poison in the air. $500. For that kind of money, every gun hand between here and Mexico would be hunting him. Macoons whimpered softly, sensing Aiyana's tension. The dog couldn't see the danger, couldn't understand the words that had just sealed their fate, but he could feel the fear radiating from the man who had become his entire world. "Quiet, little bear," Aiyana whispered, stroking the dog's head. "We are in trouble now. More trouble than you know. But even as he spoke the words, Aiyana felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the fierce, protective instinct of a father. The bounty hunters would kill Macoons without a second thought. The dog was evidence of Aiyana's presence, nothing more. The idea of those cold-eyed men putting a bullet in this trusting creature made Aiyana's vision blur with rage. He had failed to protect his family. He would not fail to protect Macoon. That evening, as they sheltered in a hidden alcove deeper in the canyons, Aiyana made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He began to teach the dog to understand him, not just his voice but his intentions, his movements, the subtle signals that might one day mean the difference between life and death. "Listen, Macoons," he said, placing his hand on the dog's head. "When I say silent, you must make no sound. Like this, silent." He pressed gently, and amazingly Macoons seemed to understand, settling down without even a whimper. When Aiyana released the pressure, the dog's tail wagged. "Good," Aiyana breathed. "Very good, little bear." They worked through the night, developing a language of touch and tone. A hand on the back meant stop. A gentle tug meant follow. A specific whistle meant come, no matter what. And always, always, the word silent meant absolute quiet, the kind that could save their lives. Macoons learned with the desperate intelligence of a creature who had already survived the impossible. By dawn, he could obey basic commands, could sense Aiyana's mood through touch and voice alone. More than that, he had begun to anticipate his protector's needs, moving closer when Aiyana's breathing changed, with remembered nightmares, offering wordless comfort with his presence. "You understand too much," Aiyana told him as the first light crept into their hiding place. "You see more blind than most men do, with their eyes." It was true. The dog seemed to sense things Aiyana missed, changes in the wind that meant weather, sounds that spoke of distant danger, the subtle shift in air pressure that preceded a sandstorm. Without sight, Macoons had developed senses that bordered on the supernatural. But it was more than that. The dog had begun to read Aiyana's emotions, responding to grief with gentle pressure against his leg, to anger with patient stillness, to fear with alertness that made him a silent partner in their survival. On the fifth day, that partnership saved both their lives. They were moving through a narrow passage between towering rock walls when Macoon suddenly froze, his ears perked and his body tense with alarm. Aiyana stopped immediately, trusting the dog's superior hearing. From somewhere ahead came the faint sound of men's voices, too distant to make out words but close enough to spell danger. Aiyana counted at least 4 different speakers, maybe more. Without hesitation, he gave the signal for silence and began to retreat the way they'd come. Macoons followed perfectly, his paws silent on the stone, his breathing controlled despite his obvious fear. They found an alternative route through a crack in the canyon wall, so narrow they had to squeeze through sideways. On the other side, hidden in deep shadow, they watched as 6 mounted men rode through the passage they'd just abandoned. Bounty hunters, all of them, armed to the teeth and moving with the systematic precision of professional killers. If they had continued forward, they would have walked straight into an ambush. "Good boy," Aiyana whispered, his hand trembling as he stroked Macoon's head. "Good, brave boy." The dog's tail wagged once, silently, and Aiyana felt his throat tighten with emotion. This creature, blind and dependent, had just saved his life, had become not just a burden to protect, but a partner in survival. That night, as they shared the last of the rabbit meat in a cave high above the canyon floor, Aiyana found himself talking to Macoons as he hadn't talked to anyone in 3 years. "My daughter would have loved you," he said softly, his voice carrying in the darkness. "Nayela, that was her name. It means I love you in our language. She always wanted a dog, but I told her dogs were too much trouble, too hard to keep safe." Macoons rested his head on Aiyana's leg, offering the comfort of his presence. "I was wrong about many things," Aiyana continued. "I thought love made you weak, thought caring for others was a luxury I couldn't afford. But you've made me stronger, little bear, made me remember what I was fighting for." In the darkness, Aiyana could almost hear Nayeli's laughter, could almost feel Itzil's hand in his. The pain was still there, would always be there, but now it was joined by something else. Purpose, hope, the fierce joy of having something precious to protect. Makoun sighed contentedly and settled into sleep, trusting completely in the man who had saved his life and was teaching him to navigate a world he couldn't see. And for the first time since the night his family died, Aiyana slept without nightmare, comforted by the steady breathing of a creature who had taught him the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest strength came not from standing alone, but from choosing to care for another, especially when the world had given you every reason to stop caring at all. The storm came from the north like a living thing, turning the sky the color of dried blood and filling the air with grit that cut like glass. Aiyana pressed himself and Makoun deeper into the shallow cave they'd found, watching the world disappear behind a wall of wind and sand. "Bad storm," he murmured to the dog, who had grown restless as the barometric pressure dropped. "We may be here for days," Makoun whined softly, his enhanced senses picking up something in the approaching tempest that made his hackles rise. The dog had been increasingly agitated all morning, pausing frequently to lift his nose to the wind, his ears swiveling toward sounds Aiyana couldn't hear. "What is it, little bear?" Aiyana asked, stroking the dog's trembling flank. "What do you sense that I cannot?" The answer came with the storm's first violent gust. Voices, human voices, carried on the wind from somewhere in the maze of canyons below. Bounty hunters caught in the open by the sudden weather, seeking shelter just as they had. Aiyana's hand moved instinctively to his knife as he counted the distinct voices. At least 4 men, maybe 5, all moving in their general direction. In the confined space of the cave, there would be no room to maneuver, no escape if they were discovered. "Silent, Makoun," he whispered, giving the hand signal they'd practiced. Silent and still, the dog immediately pressed himself against the cave wall, becoming as motionless as stone. Only his rapid breathing betrayed his presence, and even that was barely audible above the howling wind. The voices grew louder as the men took shelter in the canyon below. Through the storm's fury, Aiyana caught fragments of conversation that made his blood run cold. "Apache's got to be close. No other water for 20 miles. $500 dead, 1,000 alive. Why they want him breathing is beyond me. Heard he's got some kind of animal with him. Dog or something. Makes him easier to track." Makoun tensed at the word dog, as if understanding that he was being discussed. Aiyana's hand tightened on his fur, both comfort and warning. They knew about the dog. Somehow word had spread that the Apache fugitive traveled with a companion, making them both targets. The storm raged for 3 hours, and through it all, the bounty hunters remained in the canyon below, their voices drifting up whenever the wind died. Aiyana learned more about his situation than he'd wanted to know. The military wanted him alive for questioning about other Apache holdouts. The civilian authorities would settle for his corpse. And everyone, it seemed, knew about Makoun's. "Smart dog," one of the hunters said during a lull in the wind. "Blind, they say, but smart as a whip. Apache's teaching it tricks, using it like a scout. Don't matter how smart it is," another voice replied. "Dead's dead. We find them, we kill them both. Easier than trying to separate them." Aiyana felt something dark and violent rise in his chest. These men would kill Makoun without hesitation, would gun down a helpless animal for no reason other than convenience. The rage was familiar, the same fury that had sustained him through 3 years of running and hiding, but now it was different, purified by purpose. He would not let them harm his little bear. When the storm finally passed, the bounty hunters moved on, following what they thought was Aiyana's trail deeper into the canyon system. They were wrong. Aiyana had deliberately laid false signs 2 days earlier, leading north, while he and the Makoun traveled south. It would buy them time, but not much. As soon as the men were gone, Aiyana and Macoons emerged from their shelter. The storm had transformed the landscape, erasing all tracks and scent trails, giving them a temporary advantage. But it had also revealed something that made Aiyana's heart skip a beat. On the far side of the canyon, partially hidden by fallen rocks, was the charred ruin of what had once been a small settlement. Apache wickiups, burned to the ground, their blackened poles reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. "No," Aiyana whispered, the word torn from him like a physical wound. But even as he denied it, he recognized the place. The arrangement of the burned structures, the particular bend in the canyon wall, the ancient petroglyphs that had watched over his people for generations. This was his village. This was home, or what was left of it. Macoons sensed his distress immediately, pressing close against his leg and whimpering softly. But Aiyana barely noticed. His feet carried him forward without conscious thought, drawn by a force stronger than logic or caution. The first body was near what had been the ceremonial fire circle, bones now, picked clean by scavengers and bleached white by the desert sun. But Aiyana knew those bones, knew the silver bracelet that still encircled the skeletal wrist. "Itzel," he breathed, falling to his knees beside the remains of his wife. The grief hit him like a physical blow, 3 years of suppressed anguish breaking free all at once. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had dreamed of finding their bodies and giving them proper burial. But the reality was worse than any nightmare, seeing the scattered bones of the woman who had been his heart, his anchor, his reason for living. Macoons approached cautiously, sensing the profound sorrow radiating from his protector. The dog's nose twitched as he investigated the remains, and something in his posture changed. His tail dropped, his ears flattened, and he let out a low, mournful whine that seemed to echo Aiyana's grief. "She would have loved you," Aiyana whispered, his voice breaking. "Would have sneaked you scraps when I wasn't looking, just like she did for every stray that wandered into camp." He found Neali's remains near what had been their family wickiup, the small bones heartbreaking in their fragility. Her favorite doll, carved from cottonwood by Aiyana's own hands, lay beside her, somehow untouched by fire and time. The weight of his failure crashed down on him with renewed force. He had been hunting when the soldiers came, had returned to find his world in flames and his family gone. For 3 years, he had told himself they might have aced, might have been captured and taken to a reservation. The truth was worse than any lie he'd constructed. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the bones of his daughter. "I'm so sorry, little star. I should have been here, should have protected you." Macoons approached the small skeleton with surprising gentleness, sniffing delicately before settling down beside the remains with a soft whimper. It was as if the dog understood that these bones represented something precious, someone who should have been protected and wasn't. The sight of the blind dog keeping vigil over his daughter's remains broke something fundamental inside Aiyana. The tears came then, 3 years' worth of grief pouring out in great racking sobs that echoed off the canyon walls. He wept for Itzel's laughter, forever silenced, for Neali's questions that would never be answered, for the life they should have had, the future that had been stolen from them in a single morning of violence and hate. But as he grieved, Macoons never left his side. The dog pressed close, offering what comfort he could, his warm presence a reminder that even in the darkest moments, Aiyana was not entirely alone. When the tears finally stopped, Aiyana began the grim work of gathering the scattered bone. He would bury them properly, with the prayers and rituals his people deserved. It would take time they couldn't afford with bounty hunters searching for them, but some things mattered more than survival. "Help me, little bear," he said softly to Macoons. "Help me lay them to rest." The dog seemed to understand, staying close as Aiyana worked, occasionally nosing gently at bones that had been scattered by animals or weather. Together they collected the remains of Aiyana's family, preparing them for the journey to their final rest. As the sun began to set, painting the ruined village in shades of gold and crimson, Aiyana realized something profound had changed. The rage that had sustained him for 3 years was still there, but it was no longer the blind fury of a man with nothing to lose. Now it was focused, purposeful, the protective anger of someone who had found something worth fighting for. Macoons had given him that, had shown him that love didn't make you weak, it made you stronger, more dangerous, more determined to protect what mattered. "They will pay for this," Aiyana whispered to his dog, his voice carrying a promise as hard as desert stone. "But first we honor the dead. First we remember what we've lost." The blind dog's tail wagged once, and Aiyana could have sworn he saw understanding in those clouded eyes. Understanding, and something that might have been approval. Tomorrow they would begin the dangerous journey, near the sacred burial grounds in the high desert. Tonight, they would keep vigil with the dead, two survivors holding watch over those who could no longer protect themselves. But they would not keep that vigil alone. For the first time since the massacre, Aiyana felt the presence of his ancestors, their spirits drawn back by the love he'd rediscovered through a blind dog's trust. The village might be ruins, but the bonds of family, both born and chosen, remained stronger than death, deeper than grief, more enduring than the hatred of those who would see them destroyed. And sometimes in the vast loneliness of the desert, that was enough to keep the darkness at bay. The burial ground lay 3 days' hard travel to the north, across terrain that would challenge even the most experienced desert traveler. For a man carrying the bones of his family and traveling with a blind dog, the journey bordered on impossible. But impossible was a word Aiyana had learned to ignore. He fashioned a travois from dried mesquite branches and strips of leather cut from his own clothing, creating a frame that would carry the precious remains while allowing Macoons to help pull the load. The dog seemed to understand the solemnity of their mission, accepting the makeshift harness without complaint and learning to navigate by the sound of Aiyana's footsteps and the gentle pressure of the lead rope. "Easy, little bear," Aiyana murmured as they began their ascent from the canyon floor. "We carry more than bones now. We carry memory. We carry love." The first day took them through the Badlands, a maze of eroded hills and hidden arroyos where flash floods had carved the earth into impossible shapes. It was treacherous terrain under the best of circumstances, deadly for a blind dog, pulling a travois loaded with the fragile remains of the dead. But Macoons moved with careful precision, his enhanced senses compensating for his lack of sight. When loose rocks threatened to shift under his paws, he would pause, testing each step before committing his weight. When the travois caught on brush or stone, he would stop immediately, waiting for Aiyana to clear the path. "You understand," Aiyana said with something approaching wonder as they made camp that first evening. "You know what we carry, don't you?" The dog's response was to lie down beside the travois, resting his head near where Nayeli's small bones lay, wrapped in what remained of Aiyana's cleanest shirt. It was a gesture of protection, of respect, that brought tears to Aiyana's eyes. The second day brought new dangers. They were crossing an exposed ridge when Macoons suddenly froze, his ears pricked and his body tense with alarm. Aiyana immediately dropped to the ground, pulling the dog down beside him. In the distance, rising from a valley they would have to cross, was a thin column of smoke, not the black smoke of a wildfire, but the deliberate grey plume of a campfire. Someone was out there directly in their path to the sacred grounds. Aiyana studied the terrain through the heat shimmer, counting possibilities and finding none that offered safe passage. The valley was the only route that wouldn't add days to their journey, days they couldn't afford with their water running low and the bones of his family growing more fragile with each mile traveled. "What do you think, little bear?" he asked softly. "Do we risk the open ground or do we find another way?" Macoons whined softly, his nose twitching as he tested the air. Something in his posture suggested danger, not immediate but present. The dog had learned to read the desert's moods as well as any Apache scout, and his instincts had kept them alive more than once. They waited until nightfall, using the cover of darkness to descend into the valley. The campfire belonged to a group of traders, 3 Mexican merchants with a string of pack mules, making their way north toward Tucson. Under normal circumstances, Aiyana might have avoided them entirely, or even traded for supplies, but nothing about their circumstances was normal. The traders were camped near the only reliable water source in the valley, a spring that bubbled up from deep underground to form a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees. Aiyana and Macoons would have to approach within 50 yards of the camp to reach the water they desperately needed. Silent, Aiyana whispered to the dog, giving the familiar hand signal. Silent as shadows, they moved through the darkness like ghosts, the travois wheels wrapped in strips of leather to muffle any sound. Macoons navigated by scent and sound alone, trusting completely in Aiyana's guidance as they threaded between sleeping forms and tethered animals. At the spring, Aiyana filled his water skins while Macoons drank carefully from the pool. The dog's enhanced hearing picked up every snore, every shift of the sleeping traders, alerting Aiyana to any change in the camp's rhythm. They were almost clear when one of the mules caught Macoon's scent and snorted in alarm. The sound was loud in the desert stillness, and immediately one of the traders stirred. "¿Qué pasa?" the man mumbled, sitting up and reaching for his rifle. Aiyana and Macoons froze in the shadow of a large boulder, barely 20 feet from the camp. The trader looked around sleepily, his eyes trying to penetrate the darkness. After a long moment, he shrugged and settled back down, attributing the mule's nervousness to the presence of coyotes or javelinas. They waited another hour before moving, ensuring the trader was deep in sleep before continuing their careful retreat. By dawn, they were miles away, but the encounter had cost them precious time and energy. The third day dawned clear and mercilessly hot. They were climbing now, following ancient trails toward the high country where Aiyana's people had buried their dead for countless generations. The air grew thinner with each mile, and Macoons began to struggle, his breathing labored and his steps increasingly uncertain. "Come, little bear," Aiyana encouraged, stopping frequently to let the dog rest. Not much further now, the ancestors wait, but even as he spoke the words, Aiyana could see that Macoons was failing. The journey that would have been challenging for a healthy dog was pushing the blind animal beyond his limits. His paws were bleeding again, worn raw by the rocky terrain, and his sides heaved with each labored breath. By midday, Macoons could barely walk. He would take a few steps, stumble, rest, then struggle to his feet and continue. His determination was heartbreaking to watch. The dog was literally willing himself forward through sheer devotion to his protector. "Enough," Aiyana said finally, lifting Macoons and settling him on top of the travois beside the bundled remains. "You have done enough, little bear. Let me carry you for a while." The dog tried to protest, struggling weakly against Aiyana's hands, but exhaustion won out. Within minutes he was asleep, his head resting against the bundle that contained Naili's bones. Aiyana pulled the travois alone for the rest of the day, his muscles screaming with the effort, but his spirit somehow lighter. There was something profoundly right about carrying both the dead and the living together, about shouldering the full weight of those who depended on him. As the sun began to set, they finally reached the sacred grounds, a high mesa dotted with ancient burial cairns and marked by petroglyphs older than memory. The sight of it brought Aiyana to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of finally reaching their destination. Macoons stirred at the cessation of movement, lifting his head to sniff the thin air. Something in the dog's posture changed, his ears pricked forward, his tail gave a tentative wag, and he whined softly with what sounded almost like recognition. "You feel it too," Aiyana whispered, stroking the dog's head. "The presence of those who came before. They welcome us, little bear. They welcome us home." That night, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, Aiyana began the burial ritual. He dug graves with his bare hands in the hard earth, speaking the old prayers in a voice rusty from years of silence. Macoons lay nearby, no longer exhausted, but somehow peaceful, as if the sacred ground itself was giving him strength. When the sun rose, Aiyana's family rested in the earth of their ancestors, their spirits finally free to join those who had gone before. The ritual had taken all night, but it had also done something Aiyana hadn't expected. It had begun to heal the wounds in his own spirit. "It is finished," he said to Macoons as they stood together at the edge of the mesa, looking out over the vast desert that stretched to the horizon. "They are home, they are at peace." The dog pressed against his leg, offering comfort and companionship in the face of loss. But for the first time since finding the ruins of his village, Aiyana felt something other than grief. He felt causa, purpose, the calm that came from completing a sacred duty. "Now what, little bear?" he asked, scratching behind Macoon's ears. "What do two wanderers do when their mission is complete?" The answer came not in words but in understanding, a moment of perfect clarity that seemed to rise from the sacred ground itself. They had honored the dead, but they were still alive, still together, still responsible for each other's survival and well-being. The bounty hunters would still be hunting them. The desert would still test their resolve. The world would still be hard and unforgiving, but they would face it together. The Apache warrior and his blind companion, bound by something stronger than circumstance, deeper than survival. They had become family, not through blood, but through choice, through loyalty, through the kind of love that transformed weakness into strength. As they began their descent from the sacred mesa, Aiyana found himself smiling for the first time in 3 years. The future was uncertain, dangerous, full of challenges that would test them both. But whatever came next, they would meet it together, and sometimes in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything good and gentle, that was miracle enough. The peace of the sacred grounds lasted exactly 2 days. Aiyana first noticed the dust cloud on the southern horizon as he and Macoons made their morning descent toward the desert floor. At this distance it could have been anything, a dust devil, a small herd of wild horses, even a trader's caravan. But something about its deliberate movement, its steady progress toward their position, made his blood turn cold. "Riders," he whispered to Macoons, who immediately pressed low against the rocky ground. "Many ride." Through the shimmering heat, Aiyana counted at least 8 mounted figures moving in a coordinated search pattern. Even at this distance, the glint of sunlight on metal told him they were well armed. These weren't casual travelers, or even ordinary bounty hunters. This was a professional hunting party, and they were closing in. Macoons whined softly, his enhanced senses picking up something that made his hackles rise. The dog had grown increasingly agitated as they descended from the mesa, stopping frequently to test the air with his nose, his ears swiveling toward sounds only he could hear. "What is it, little bear?" Aiyana asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "What do you smell that I cannot?" The answer came with the morning wind, the acrid scent of too many horses, too many men, and something else that made Aiyana's stomach clench with recognition. Bloodhounds. The hunting party had brought tracking dog. "We run," he said simply, gathering their few possessions with practiced efficiency. The travois had served its purpose and would only slow them now. Everything except water and weapons was abandoned, as they began a desperate flight across terrain that offered little cover and less mercy. But they were already too late. The hunters had spread out in a wide net, cutting off escape routes with the methodical precision of men who had done this before. Within an hour, Aiyana could hear the baying of the hounds, their voices echoing off the canyon walls with terrifying enthusiasm. Macoons was struggling again, his paws still tender from their journey to the burial grounds. His breathing labored in the thin air. But the dog never faltered, never showed anything but determination to keep pace with his protector. Even as the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer, they found temporary shelter in a narrow slot canyon, its walls rising so high above them that the sky was reduced to a thin strip of blue. Here at least, the scent trail would be confused by the conflicting air current, but Aiyana knew it would buy them hours at most, not the days they needed to truly escape. "Rest," he told Macoons, who collapsed gratefully in the shade of the canyon wall. "Rest while you can." But even as the dog panted in the cool shadows, his ears remained alert, tracking the sounds of their pursuers with the focused intensity of a creature who understood that death was hunting them both. The voices of the hunters drifted down into the canyon, closer now, discussing their strategy with the casual professionalism of men who killed for a living. Trail goes cold here. Spread out, check every crevice. Dogs are going crazy. Apaches close, real close. Remember, $1,000 alive, 500 dead. But don't take any chances with that redskin. Macoons tensed at the harsh voices, a low growl building in his throat despite his exhaustion. Aiyana placed a gentle hand on the dog's head, silencing him with a touch. "Easy, little bear," he whispered. "Save your anger. We will need it soon." But even as he spoke the words, Aiyana was calculating odds and finding them impossible. 8 armed men tracking dogs, and open desert between them and any real sanctuary. Even if they could slip past this hunting party, there would be others. The bounty had drawn every killer in the territory, and the net was tightening with each passing day. For the first time since rescuing Macoons, Aiyana considered the unthinkable. The dog would be safer without him. A blind animal wandering the desert would likely die, but it would die free, not gunned down in a crossfire meant for his protector. If Aiyana left him here, in this sheltered canyon, with what water he could spare, Macoons might have a chance. It would be the merciful thing to do, the practical thing, the choice that prioritized the dog's life over Aiyana's need for companionship. But as he looked into those trusting, sightless eyes, Aiyana knew he couldn't do it. They had become something more than man and dog, more than protector and protected. They were family now, bound by loyalty deeper than blood, stronger than fear. Where one went, the other would follow. Whatever fate awaited them, they would meet it together. The decision brought a strange peace, the calm that came from accepting the inevitable. If this was their last day, at least they would spend it as they had spent all the others, side by side, facing the world's cruelty with whatever courage they could muster. The sound of approaching hoofbeats ended their brief respite. The hunters had found the canyon entrance, and their voices carried a note of excitement that made Aiyana's blood run cold. Fresh tracks, leading in. Got him cornered. Careful now. Apache's tricky as a sidewinder. Just remember that dog. It's smart, trained. Don't let it warn him. Aiyana checked his weapons, a worn cavalry saber taken from a dead soldier, a knife his grandfather had made, and a single-shot pistol with 3 bullets remaining. Against 8 armed men, it was laughably inadequate. But he had one advantage they didn't expect. He was no longer fighting just for himself. "Come, Macoons," he whispered, helping the dog to his feet. "Time to show these hunters what happens when they threaten our family." They moved deeper into the canyon, looking for a defensible position, somewhere Aiyana could make his stand while keeping Macoons as safe as possible. The slot narrowed as it progressed, the walls closing in until they were barely wide enough for a horse and rider. Perfect. Aiyana found what he was looking for, a place where the canyon made a sharp turn, creating a natural ambush point. Here the hunters would have to come at him one at a time, unable to use their superior numbers effectively. "Stay here, little bear," he told Macoons, settling the dog behind a large boulder that would provide some protection from gunfire. "No matter what happens, stay down, stay quiet, stay alive." But Macoons had other ideas. As Aiyana moved toward his chosen position, the dog followed, refusing to be left behind even when directly commanded. His message was clear. They had faced everything else together, and he would not abandon his protector now. "Stubborn fool," Aiyana murmured, but there was love in his voice, not anger. "Very well, we make our stand together." The first hunter appeared around the bend moments later, his rifle raised and ready. He was a big man with cold eyes and scars that spoke of a violent life. Behind him, Aiyana could hear the others spreading out, trying to flank his position. "There he is," the hunter shouted. "Got you now, Apache." The man's finger tightened on the trigger, but he never got the chance to fire it. Macoons, moving with the deadly precision his blindness had taught him, launched himself from beside the boulder. His teeth found the hunter's gun hand, and the rifle discharge went wild, the bullet sparking off stone instead of flesh. The hunter screamed and tried to shake off the dog, But Macoons held on with the desperate strength of a creature fighting for his family's life. In that moment of confusion, Aiyana struck with his grandfather's knife, ending the threat with silent efficiency. But the gunshot had alerted the others, and now they came in a rush, abandoning caution for overwhelming force. Aiyana's world exploded into chaos, gunfire echoing off canyon walls, horses screaming, men shouting orders and curses as they tried to coordinate their attack in the confined space. Macoons fought beside him like a demon, his blindness no handicap in the swirling confusion of combat. The dog seemed to sense where each threat was coming from, intercepting riders trying to flank his protector, creating havoc among the horses with his fearless attacks. Aiyana fought with the desperate fury of a man protecting everything he had left in the world. His bullets found their marks, his blade tasted blood, and for a few impossible minutes, it seemed they might actually survive the overwhelming odds. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming. A rifle bullet creased Aiyana's ribs, spinning him around and nearly dropping him to his knees. Another grazed his shoulder, sending his pistol spinning away across the rocky ground. That's when everything went wrong. Macoons, trying to reach a fallen rifle that might help their desperate fight, stepped into the path of a mounted hunter's charge. The horse, trained for war and maddened by the chaos, reared up with iron-shod hooves, flashing in the desert sun. Aiyana screamed, abandoning his own fight to throw himself toward his companion. He was too late. The hooves came down with crushing force, and Macoon's yelp of pain cut through the sounds of battle like a knife through Aiyana's heart. The dog lay motionless where he'd fallen, blood pooling beneath his still form. His eyes, those trusting, sightless eyes that had looked to Aiyana for everything, were closed, his breathing shallow and labored. Something fundamental broke inside Aiyana's chest. The rage that followed wasn't the cold fury of a warrior in battle, but the primal, devastating wrath of a father watching his child die. What happened next would be talked about in saloons and trading posts for years to come. The Apache who fought like 10 men, who killed with bare hands when his weapons were gone, who seemed to draw strength from his very grief and transform it into something terrifying and pure. When the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire finally faded, 6 hunters lay dead in the narrow canyon. The remaining 2 had fled, their nerve broken by the sight of a man who fought as if death itself was his ally. But Aiyana barely noticed. He was on his knees beside Macoons, his hands hovering over injuries he couldn't heal, his voice breaking as he spoke words of comfort to a creature who might not even be able to hear them. "I'm here, little bear," he whispered, the same words he'd spoken to Nayeli in her final moments. "I'm here, don't be afraid." Macoon's eyes fluttered open, finding Aiyana's face with the unerring accuracy of a love that needed no sight to guide it. His tail moved once weakly, and a soft whine escaped his throat. "That's right," Aiyana said, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here. I won't leave you. I promise." But even as he made the promise, he could see the light fading from those gentle eyes, could feel the life ebbing from the body that had followed him so faithfully through the harsh desert. Macoons was dying, and there was nothing Aiyana could do to stop it. The dog's breathing grew shallower, more labored. His eyes began to close, and Aiyana felt his world ending all over again. First his family, now his little bear, everyone he loved. Everyone who trusted him, everyone he'd sworn to protect, all of them taken by violence, all of them dying in his arms. "Please," he whispered to whatever gods might be listening, "please don't take him too. Haven't I lost enough?" But the desert gods were cruel, and they demanded their price for love. Even as Aiyana held his dying companion, he could hear the distant sound of more riders approaching, reinforcements drawn by the gunfire, coming to finish what their comrades had started. The final battle was coming, and this time, Aiyana would face it alone, just as he'd always feared he would. The sound of approaching riders grew louder as Aiyana cradled Macoons against his chest, feeling the dog's life slipping away with each labored breath. Blood soaked through his shirt, some his own from the rifle wounds, most of it from the creature who had given everything to protect him. "Stay with me, little bear," Aiyana whispered, his voice breaking as Makun's breathing became more shallow. "Please, don't leave me alone in this darkness." But even as he spoke, he could see the inevitable approaching. Makun's eyes were glazing over, his body growing still in Aiyana's arms. The dog who had taught him to love again, who had shown him that hope could survive even in the harshest wilderness, was dying. The hoofbeats were closer now, at least a dozen riders from the sound of it. They would be here within minutes, and when they came, they would find an Apache warrior, with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to run. Makun's stirred weakly, his clouded eyes finding Aiyana's face one last time. With tremendous effort, the dog lifted his head and pressed his muzzle against Aiyana's cheek, a final gesture of love from a creature whose entire world had been the sound of one man's voice. "I know," Aiyana whispered, understanding what the dog was trying to tell him. "I know you have to go, but I want you to know, you saved me, little bear. When I was lost in my own darkness, you showed me the way home." A single tear fell from Makun's eyes, as if he too understood that their journey together was ending. His tail moved once, the faintest wag, before his body went still in Aiyana's arms. "No," Aiyana breathed, pressing his ear to the dog's chest, listening desperately for a heartbeat that was no longer there. "No, no, no." The grief that followed was beyond words, beyond reason. It was the sound of a man's soul breaking, echoing off the canyon walls like the cry of something wild and wounded. For 3 years, he had survived by building walls around his heart, by refusing to feel anything that might weaken his resolve. But Makun's had torn down those walls, had taught him that love was worth the pain it inevitably brought, and now that love was gone, leaving him more alone than he had ever been. The riders appeared at the canyon mouth, as Aiyana knelt beside his fallen companion, their voices harsh with anticipation and greed. More bounty hunters, drawn by the promise of easy money and the sound of gunfire. "There, in the narrow part," one of them shouted. "Surround him. Don't let the bastard escape." But Aiyana made no move to run, no attempt to find cover or prepare for battle. He simply knelt beside Makun's still form, one hand resting on the dog's head, speaking softly in Apache, words of love, words of farewell, words that promised they would meet again in the land where spirits ran free beneath eternal stars. "Give it up, Apache," the lead hunter called out, his rifle trained on Aiyana's chest. "You're outnumbered and wounded. Surrender now and we'll make it quick." Aiyana looked up slowly, his face streaked with tears and blood, his eyes holding something that made several of the hunters shift nervously in their saddles. This was not the expression of a defeated man. This was the face of someone who had lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. "My name," Aiyana said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air, "is Aiyana of the Chiricahua Apache. I am the son of Nalnish, grandson of Cochise, keeper of the old ways, and this," he gestured to Makun's still form, "this was my family." The hunters exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected pleas for mercy, perhaps a desperate last stand. Aiyana smiled, setting aside his work to ruffle the child's dark hair. "And what has he taught you, little star?" The endearment came naturally now, no longer a source of pain, but a bridge between past love and present affection. Aisha reminded him so much of Naeli, not in looks but in spirit, in the fearless curiosity that made children ask difficult questions and accept impossible answers. "That family isn't always born," she replied seriously, her young face solemn with newfound wisdom. "Sometimes it's chosen, sometimes it finds you when you need it most." The words hit Aiyana with the force of truth, spoken from the mouth of innocence, but carrying the weight of hard-earned understanding. Family wasn't always born. Sometimes it was rescued from the desert floor, nursed back to health with precious water and stubborn hope. A commotion near the camp's entrance drew his attention. Scouts were returning from patrol, their faces grim with news that made the camp elders gather quickly. Aiyana rose, Macoons immediately appearing at his side, with the intuitive timing that never failed to amaze him. "What word?" Aiyana asked in Apache as he joined the council circle. "Bad news from the south," the lead scout replied. "The white soldiers are moving again, searching the desert with new purpose. They've learned about our camp, about the survivors gathered here." Silence fell over the circle as the implications sank in. This place had been sanctuary, had been home, but safety was always temporary for their people. The outside world would not leave them in peace forever. "How long do we have?" asked the war leader, his scarred hands already moving to check his weapons. "Days, maybe a week. They're bringing Apache scouts with them, our own people, forced to hunt us for the white man's gold." The circle erupted in angry voices, men speaking of ambush, of fighting, of making the soldiers pay dearly for disturbing their peace. But Aiyana found himself looking at Aiyasha, at the other children playing nearby, at the women tending cookfires and mending clothes. This was what they had built here, not just a hiding place, but a community, a place where laughter could exist alongside vigilance. Macoons pressed against his leg, sensing the tension in the air, ready to follow wherever his protector might lead. The dog had given up one life already for love. Was Aiyana prepared to ask him to risk another? "There is another way," Aiyana said quietly, his voice cutting through the angry debate. The circle fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He had been with them only 6 months, but his reputation had preceded him, the Apache who had walked alone through the desert for 3 years, who had fought off entire hunting parties, who had somehow tamed a wild dog and turned it into a brother. "Speak," the war leader said simply. "I will go to them." Aiyana continued, his decision crystallizing even as he spoke the words. "I will surrender myself, offer them the bounty they seek. In exchange, they leave this place in peace. Allow the women and children to live without fear." "No," Aiyasha cried out, having crept close enough to hear. "You can't leave us. You can't leave Macoons." The dog whined softly at the distress in the child's voice, moving to comfort her, even as his own body tensed with understanding. Animals might not grasp human words, but they understood sacrifice, understood the weight of difficult choices. "Little star," Aiyana said gently, kneeling to bring himself to the child's level. "Sometimes the people who love us make hard choices to keep us safe. My family." He gestured to include the entire camp, but his hand came to rest on Macoon's head. "My family is worth any sacrifice. But the soldiers will kill you," Aiyasha whispered, tears streaming down her young face. "And then Macoons will be alone again." It was the fear that had haunted Aiyana through the long nights, the terrible possibility that his death would leave the dog abandoned once more. But as he looked into those trusting, sightless eyes, he saw something that gave him hope. Macoons was no longer the broken creature he had found dying in the desert. The dog had learned to trust not just one voice, but many, had accepted the love of children, the gentle hands of healers, the patient guidance of elders. He had found his place in this community as surely as Aiyana had. "He won't be alone," Aiyana realized aloud. "None of us will be alone anymore. That's what family means, that love survives even when the ones who taught it to us are gone." The war leader shook his head firmly. "We do not sacrifice our own to buy peace with the white man. If they want this camp, they will pay in blood. And how many of our children will pay the same price?" Aiyana counted. "How many mothers will mourn sons who could have lived? How many futures will we bury to preserve the past?" The argument might have continued, but Macoons chose that moment to do something extraordinary. The dog walked to the center of the circle, sat down and began to howl. Not the wild cry of a wolf, but something deeper, more purposeful. It was the sound of grief and acceptance, of understanding and farewell. Everyone in the camp fell silent, even the children stopping their play to listen. The howl went on for nearly a minute, carrying in its haunting melody all the pain of the years, all the loss, all the love, that had somehow survived in the face of impossible odds. When it ended, Macoons walked back to Aiyana and pressed against his leg, offering comfort and receiving it in return. The message was clear to everyone present. The dog understood the choice that lay before them, and like a true Apache warrior, he would face it with courage. But it was Aiyana who provided the solution, her young voice cutting through the adult debate with the clarity that only children possess. "Why does he have to go alone?" she asked simply. The question hung in the air like a revelation. Why, indeed, did sacrifice have to mean solitude? Why couldn't love be carried forward, shared among those who understood its value? "She's right," Aiyana said slowly, a new plan forming in his mind. "I will go to the soldiers, offer myself for the safety of the camp. But Macoons comes with me." "To die beside you?" the war leader asked harshly. "To live," Aiyana replied with growing certainty. "To show them that Apache people are not the savages they believe us to be. To prove that we are capable of the same love, the same loyalty, the same sacrifice that they claim makes them civilized." It was a desperate gamble, staking everything on the hope that humanity could recognize itself in the bond between a man and his dog. But sometimes desperate gambles were the only choice left when all conventional wisdom led to tragedy. The council debated through the night, voices rising and falling like the desert wind. But by dawn, the decision was made. Aiyana would go to meet the approaching soldiers, carrying with him not just his own fate, but the hopes of everyone who had chosen to make this hidden canyon their home. As he prepared for the journey that might be his last, the entire camp gathered to see him off. Children pressed small gifts into his hands, carved animals, braided grass, smooth stones that carried their wishes for his safe return. The women sang traveling songs, their voices weaving protection around him like invisible armor. But it was Macoons who provided the most meaningful farewell. The dog approached each member of the camp in turn, allowing them to touch him, to speak words of gratitude and love. It was as if he understood that he might not return, and wanted to carry the memory of each person's kindness with him into whatever awaited them beyond the canyon walls. When the ritual was complete, Macoons returned to Aiyana's side and sat patiently, ready for whatever journey lay ahead. His message was clear: wherever his protector went, he would follow. Whatever fate awaited them, they would meet it together. "Take care of each other," Aiyana told the gathered crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "Remember what we've built here, what we've learned. And if we don't return," he paused, looking at Aiyana's tear-streaked face, at the other children who had become his heart. "Tell the stories. Keep the love alive. That's all any of us can do in the end." He turned then and walked toward the canyon mouth, Macoons padding silently beside him, ready to follow his voice into whatever darkness or light awaited them beyond the safety of home. Behind them the camp fell silent, except for the sound of Aiyana's voice, raised in the Apache traveling song, her pure young voice carrying words of protection and love across the desert. "Morning. Walk in beauty, brother. Walk in beauty, little bear. May the spirits guide your path and bring you safely home." As man and dog disappeared into the shimmering heat of the desert, their figures blending with the morning shadows, those who loved them could only wait and hope, and keep the home fires burning. For in the end, that was what family meant: the willingness to let love take its own path, trusting that, whatever form it took, wherever it led, it would always find a way to endure. The desert stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, as always. But Aiyana and Macoons walked into it without fear, their footsteps matched, their hearts joined by bonds stronger than blood, deeper than loss, more enduring than the harshest wilderness could ever be. They were going to give love one final chance to change the world, and perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough.